Clara arrived at Reed Ranch wearing a gray dress chosen by the men who had arranged the marriage. Before sunset, the foreman placed a contract beneath Silas's hand and told him where to sign. Clara said nothing until she heard the paper scrape across the table. Then she noticed the seal belonged to a bank that had closed 2 years earlier. Someone was not merely stealing from a blind rancher. They were preparing to take everything he owned. Her gray dress was torn at the hem, her wrist bruised beneath one sleeve, and the men who had delivered her were already laughing on the road behind her. Silas Reed stood on the porch, blind eyes turned toward a bride he had never requested. Then Clara heard a horse striking the barn wall and caught the bitter scent of medicine in the wind. Someone inside the ranch was already destroying what remained of his life. Martha Bell brought Clara through the kitchen, not to shame her, but to spare her from the curious eyes of the ranch hands. The room smelled of wood smoke and warm bread. Clara remained near the door until Martha placed a basin on the table and told her she could wash without asking permission. She removed her gloves carefully. A dark bruise circled one wrist, but she covered it before Martha could study it. After changing into a plain brown dress, Clara asked what work she might do in exchange for the meal. She did not ask whether Silas intended to keep her. He had not known she was coming, and she would not use his blindness to force a promise from him. Clara had grown up above her father's livestock office in Nebraska. He taught her to read shipping ledgers, compare cattle brands, calculate feed costs, and recognize figures changed after the ink dried. After his death, her uncle seized the business and declared such knowledge improper for a woman. He used her calculations while keeping her away from customers. When Clara discovered missing payments, he called her disrespectful. When she refused to sign away her claim, he called her ungrateful. When she rejected the widowed merchant he chose for her, he told the family she had ruined her last chance to be useful. Soon, even people who once praised her began calling her difficult. Her uncle packed her belongings when men from Pike Transportation arrived. They claimed a blind rancher in Wyoming needed a wife and would not care that she owned no land or money. Clara believed Silas had agreed. She learned the truth only when the wagon abandoned her at his gate. That evening, she sat across from him at the kitchen table and explained only what mattered. She had not come to deceive him. She expected no marriage. She needed one night indoors and a chance to earn enough money for the next stagecoach. Her injured hand struck the cup. Silas heard the soft sound. He did not ask who had hurt her or offer pity. He moved the bread closer and asked Martha to prepare the empty room upstairs. Before Clara could thank him, Amos Vane entered. He was broad, gray-haired, and accustomed to being obeyed. His surprise lasted only a moment. Then he smiled as though Clara's arrival solved a problem he had expected. Amos suggested the arrangement might benefit them both. A wife could quiet rumors that Silas was no longer capable of running his land. Clara would receive a respectable name and a roof. Clara noticed what he did not ask. He never questioned who brought her, where she came from, or why she wore a torn dress in the cold. He already knew. Silas tightened one hand around his cane and stated that no marriage would happen unless both people chose it freely. Later, Martha led Clara to a narrow room overlooking the east yard. A brass plate on her valise carried the mark of Pike Transportation, the same name Amos had mentioned while discussing cattle shipments. Clara opened the lining and removed an old bank seal and a sample of her father's signature. She hid both beneath the mattress. Outside, Amos crossed the yard, dragging his left boot. He stopped beneath an open window and warned a ranch hand that the new woman could work in the kitchen, but she was never to enter the ledger room. Clara listened until his footsteps disappeared. No one guarded a harmless room that carefully. By sunrise, Clara had packed her valise and expected Silas to send her toward Dry Creek. Instead, he waited beside the kitchen table with two choices. She could take the ranch wagon to town with enough money for food, or remain for 1 month, earn wages, and use the upstairs room. Staying would not make her his wife. A marriage arranged by strangers held no power over either of them. The offer unsettled Clara more than a command. She had learned that shelter usually carried a hidden price. Silas placed the decision in her hands. She chose the month. He assigned her the household inventory and pantry accounts. She would report directly to him, not Amos. Before noon, Clara heard the black gelding striking the barn wall again. Inside its stall, the animal stood with its head low, foam dried near its mouth, and one hind leg trembling. Amos said the horse was old, useless, and would be put down before the end of the week. Clara listened to its breathing. The rhythm did not match age or exhaustion. She lifted grain from the trough and caught the bitter scent she had noticed at the ranch gate. She asked that the horse be separated from the common feed. Amos refused. He said the ranch could not waste supplies because of a woman who had arrived the night before. Silas entered the barn quietly. Clara explained only what she could prove. The horse's symptoms did not appear natural, and continuing the same feed might kill it. Silas asked whether a veterinarian had examined the animal. No one had been called. Amos had made the decision alone. Silas ordered the horse moved, the trough scrubbed, and the remaining feed sealed. He placed the animal under Clara's care until a proper examination could be made. The barn fell silent. It was not blind trust. Silas had simply listened to the stronger evidence. Still, Clara felt something inside her loosen. For the first time since her father died, a man had judged her words by their truth, instead of dismissing them because a woman had spoken. Beneath the grain, Clara found a thin layer of pale powder. She wrapped a sample in cloth and slipped it into her pocket. Silas heard the movement. When she told him what she had found, he did not order her to give it to Amos. He told her to keep it safe. As they crossed the yard, Silas identified the nearby workers by their footsteps. Amos's left boot dragged slightly behind the right. Clara asked who had arranged the wagon that brought her west. Silas stopped. He had never requested a bride, paid a transportation company, or signed a marriage agreement. Someone else had sent Clara to Reed Ranch. Clara woke after midnight to the sound of the east gate lifting from its iron latch. She remained beneath the blanket and listened. One horse crossed the yard. A second followed several breaths later. Then came the quiet movement of cattle being guided away without lanterns or shouted commands. Whoever worked in the darkness knew the animals well enough to keep them calm. Clara counted the hoofbeats until they faded toward the northern trail. At breakfast, Amos reported that the night had passed without trouble. No cattle had escaped. No riders had left. Nothing was missing. Clara said nothing. Later, she carried washing toward the east yard. Fresh mud lay beneath the gate, though no rain had fallen. One hinge bore a bright scrape where the rust had been disturbed. Near the fence, she found a short piece of rope cut cleanly by a blade. She hid it beneath the linen. That morning, Martha sent her to count lamp oil beside the ledger room. The door stood partly open. A loose page on the desk listed 3 cattle as dead from fever during the previous week. Clara memorized their identifying marks. In the north pasture, she found all 3 animals alive. One had a white patch beneath its jaw. Another had a split left ear. The third carried an old reed brand near the hip. None appeared sick. When Clara returned, Amos stood in the hallway watching the mud on her boots. He asked where she had been. She answered that she had completed Martha's work. By the next morning, the loose page was gone. A replacement had been placed in the ledger. The same cattle were now described as sold, but the ink was darker than the writing around it. The paper was cleaner, and one corner had been cut with a different blade. Someone had rewritten the loss overnight. Clara took the facts to Silas. She did not accuse Amos. She described the opened gate, the cut rope, the hoofbeats, the living cattle, and the altered page. Silas listened without interruption. He warned that truth without proof could still be buried by a man who controlled the records. If Amos had help outside the ranch, confronting him too early might cause every useful document to disappear. Silas removed a narrow iron key from beneath his shirt. It opened a locked drawer in his father's old desk. Amos believed the key had been lost after the elder Reed died. Silas placed it in Clara's hand and asked her to examine whatever remained inside. The drawer resisted before opening. Clara found receipts tied with faded string. Reed Ranch had purchased enough winter feed for nearly twice the number of cattle Amos claimed they owned. Several receipts carried the seal of Dry Creek Bank. Near the bottom of one page were the initials E.P., written beside a payment absent from the ranch ledger. 2 serial numbers had been scraped away and written again. At the bottom of another invoice sat Silas Reed's signature. Clara had seen him sign the work agreement. His real hand moved slowly, with the final letter leaning downward. The invoice showed smooth strokes and an upward curve. It was not his signature. If you believe Clara is uncovering the truth for a reason, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, the person everyone doubts is the only one willing to notice what others ignore. Clara folded the forged invoice and returned the remaining papers to the drawer. Outside, Amos's dragging steps sounded against the floorboards. Then it stopped directly behind the door. Amos opened the ledger room door without knocking. Clara stood beside the old desk with the forged invoice hidden beneath a stack of receipts. For one long moment, neither of them moved. Amos asked why she was inside a room Silas had never allowed women to enter. Clara answered that Silas had given her the key. The change in Amos was small, but unmistakable. His jaw tightened before the smile returned. He reminded her that ranch records were complicated, and that a woman unfamiliar with the land could cause expensive mistakes. Clara closed the drawer. She told him the mistake had already been made. Before he could demand an explanation, Silas called from the hallway. Amos stepped aside, but the warning in his silence followed Clara from the room. That afternoon, she returned to the black gelding. The sealed feed still carried the bitter smell. Clara emptied the trough, scrubbed it with hot water, and gave the horse clean grain from a separate storehouse. She kept the pale powder wrapped in cloth inside her valise. For 2 days, the gelding received only fresh water, clean hay, and rest. Its breathing steadied. The trembling in its hind leg weakened. By the 3rd morning, it lifted its head when Clara entered the stall and accepted an apple from her palm. Amos continued to claim the improvement meant nothing. Clara asked Silas to call Jonah Price, the veterinarian from Dry Creek. Amos objected immediately. He said the ranch could not afford unnecessary visits while facing winter expenses. Silas turned toward the sound of his voice. He replied that a ranch unable to afford the truth could not afford to survive. Jonah arrived before sunset. He examined the horse, smelled the remaining feed, and studied the powder Clara had saved. He concluded that the animal had received small amounts of a strong, calming medicine over many days. The dose was not enough to kill quickly. It was enough to make a healthy horse appear weak, unreliable, and ready to be discarded. Jonah asked who had ordered the treatment. No one answered. Clara did not look at Amos. She watched the workers instead. 2 lowered their eyes. 1 stared toward the northern pasture. The horse was only the first proof. Using the copied records Silas had given her, Clara began checking the herd one section at a time. She compared ear cuts, color markings, brands, and feed totals. Animals listed as dead had vanished from the official count, yet the ranch continued purchasing enough grain to support them. Some cattle carried an old Reed brand beneath a newer mark. The second brand resembled a broken triangle. Clara had seen the same symbol on Pike transportation crates. She asked one of the younger hands where cattle bearing that mark were taken. He hesitated before admitting Amos had ordered several nighttime shipments toward Dry Creek. The men were told the animals had been sold legally and that Silas had approved everything. Silas had approved nothing. Clara brought the worker into the house and asked him to repeat the statement in Silas's presence. She did not pressure him or promise protection she could not guarantee. She simply placed the shipping dates beside the ranch ledger. On each date, Amos had recorded cattle as dead from fever, injury, or age. The numbers aligned too perfectly to be chance. Silas ordered a new system before nightfall. No animal could leave Reed Ranch without 2 workers recording its brand, destination, sale price, and buyer. Clara would keep a second ledger in a locked cabinet. Amos would no longer hold the only copy. The decision moved through the ranch faster than a winter wind. At supper, Amos spoke loudly enough for every worker to hear. He called Clara a discarded woman who had arrived without money, family, or a respectable name. He warned that Silas was allowing gratitude to replace judgment. Clara did not defend her past. She placed 3 records on the table. The first listed the black gelding as unfit and scheduled for death. The second showed the horse improving once its feed changed. The third proved that Amos had ordered medicine without recording its purpose. Then she placed the cattle ledger beside them. She asked Amos to explain why animals declared dead had been shipped through Pike transportation days later. No one touched their food. Amos said the records were misunderstood. He claimed clerks in town often copied numbers incorrectly. Clara replied that mistakes scattered themselves. Fraud repeated a pattern. Silas said nothing for several breaths. Then he announced that Clara would oversee all ranch inventories until the discrepancies were resolved. For the first time, Amos did not hide his anger. Later, Clara returned to the old receipts. One payment stood apart from the others. It had been issued 2 years earlier for lamp oil, medicine, and private transport. The date was the same night a fire in the barn had taken Silas's sight. At the bottom of the page was the broken triangle mark. Beside it were Amos Vane's initials. The morning after Clara found Amos's initials on the old receipt, she entered the kitchen before sunrise and discovered a cup of coffee waiting beside her chair. Silas was already seated near the stove, one hand resting around his own cup. He did not explain how he knew where she preferred to sit, or that she took no sugar. Clara did not ask. She simply warmed her hands around the tin cup and allowed the quiet kindness to remain what it was. By then, the household had begun to change around them. Clara read the daily ranch reports aloud while Silas listened for inconsistencies. Amos had once summarized those pages in a few hurried sentences. Clara gave Silas every number, every shipment, and every name. He remembered details other men forgot. Together, they began rebuilding an accurate picture of the ranch. In return, Silas taught Clara how he understood the land without sight. He knew the south pasture by the steady wind against his left cheek. He recognized the barn by the hollow echo beneath its roof, and the creek by the cooler air near its banks. He could tell which gate stood open by the way sound traveled across the yard. Clara stopped guiding him unless he asked. That mattered to him more than she realized. One afternoon, they inspected the northern fence before the first hard freeze. Silas found a loose post by pressing his boot against the earth. While tightening the wire, his glove caught on a broken strand. The steel cut across his palm. Clara led him to the barn and washed the wound with warm water. His hand remained still in hers while she wrapped it with clean cloth. Neither of them spoke about how natural the silence had become. Later, Clara found his old coat hanging beside the kitchen door. The lining had torn beneath one shoulder, so she repaired it after supper. The next morning, Silas ran his fingers across the new stitches and wore the coat without mentioning them. Their gratitude lived in small acts, neither demanded nor counted. Rain came hard 2 evenings later. Clara and Silas took shelter inside the barn while water struck the roof in heavy waves. The horses shifted in their stalls, restless beneath the thunder. Then footsteps sounded outside. One boot struck firmly. The other dragged across the wet ground. Clara stiffened. The sound brought back the locked storage room in Nebraska, her uncle's anger, and the scrape of metal when he turned the key. Her breath shortened before she could stop it. Silas did not touch her. He remained beside her, close enough to be present, but far enough to leave her free. He waited until her breathing steadied. Clara finally told him why locked doors frightened her. After her father's death, her uncle had tried to force her to sign away her claim to the business. When she refused, he shut her in the supply room overnight. By morning, he had already told the town she was unstable and ungrateful. She had signed nothing. Silas listened without pity. He promised that no door at Reed Ranch would ever be locked against her, and no paper would be placed beneath her hand by force. The dragging footsteps faded toward the bunkhouse. Silas's expression changed. He had heard that same uneven rhythm before, not only during the past week, but on the night of the barn fire 2 years earlier. At the time, smoke, pain, and confusion had blurred the memory. Yet one sound had remained beneath everything else. A left boot dragging across the floorboards. Clara asked whether Amos had been inside the barn that night. Silas remembered Amos claiming he had arrived only after the fire began. He remembered believing him because Amos had led him outside and stayed beside him until help came. Now the memory no longer fit. Clara brought out the receipt marked with Amos's initials. The items listed were lamp oil, medicine, and private transport. All had been purchased on the day of the fire through a company connected to Pike. Neither of them called it proof. Not yet. Still, Silas understood that the man he had trusted with his ranch might have been standing inside the barn before the flames took his sight. The realization left him quieter than anger would have. Clara did not tell him that everything would be all right. She remained beside him while the rain softened and the truth settled between them. When they returned to the house, Silas paused at the door. He no longer doubted whose footsteps had crossed the barn that night. They belonged to Amos Vane. 3 mornings later, hoofbeats approached Reed Ranch before sunrise. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Edwin Pike rode through the gate beside a deputy sheriff and 2 bank employees. Amos emerged from the bunkhouse already wearing his coat, as though he had known when they would arrive. Pike placed a foreclosure notice on the dining table. According to the document, Silas had borrowed against Reed Ranch after the barn fire. The debt was overdue, and the property would be sold at auction in 3 days. Silas asked Martha to read every line aloud. Amos interrupted, claiming the details were ordinary, and resistance would only increase the legal costs. He urged Silas to accept the sale before nothing remained. Clara watched Pike's hands. He kept one palm over the lower corner of the paper, covering the raised seal whenever Silas reached toward it. The deputy produced a second document. It accused Clara of entering Reed Ranch through a fraudulent marriage arrangement in order to control the property of a blind man. Pike demanded that she be removed for questioning. Amos turned toward the workers gathered near the doorway. He reminded them that Clara had arrived without money, family, or proof of an honorable agreement. He called her a discarded woman who had gained Silas's confidence by turning him against loyal employees. Several men looked away. Clara could have escaped through the pantry door. A saddled horse waited behind the house, and the northern trail led away from town. Silas had already offered her freedom, but leaving would return the altered ledgers, forged invoice, and surviving cattle to Amos's control. Clara stayed beside Silas. He stepped between her and the deputy without raising his voice. He did not say she belonged to him. He asked that the foreclosure notice be read from the first date to the final witness. The document claimed Silas had signed the loan inside Dry Creek Bank on October 17th, 2 years earlier. Silas remembered the date. He had been confined to bed after the barn fire, unable to stand or travel. Clara asked for the witness names. One belonged to a former bank clerk. The other was Samuel Crow, a cattle buyer who had died 6 months before the date beside his signature. The deputy's certainty weakened. Clara examined the seal Pike had tried to hide. It belonged to Dry Creek Bank's southern branch, a branch that had closed before the supposed loan was issued. Pike claimed the old seal had remained in use. Clara asked why an expired seal, a dead witness, and a signature made while Silas lay injured all appeared on the same contract. No one answered. Amos accused her of inventing objections to delay a lawful debt. He warned that Silas would lose everything if he continued protecting her. Silas turned toward Clara instead of Amos. He told the deputy she would not be removed on the strength of an unverified document. Every inconsistency was to be entered into the official record. The deputy postponed action against Clara, but Pike still held the foreclosure order. Unless stronger evidence appeared before the third morning, the auction would proceed. Would you have trusted Clara's evidence, or surrendered her to protect the ranch? Share your answer in the comments. As Pike gathered the papers, Clara noticed a faint date beneath the bank seal. It matched the day Amos had ordered the medicine found in the black gelding's feed. The documents were not separate threats. They had been prepared by the same hand. Silas did not raise his voice after Pike and the deputy left. He asked Martha to bring paper, then dictated every inconsistency in the foreclosure notice, while Clara copied the details: the expired seal, the dead witness, the impossible date, the signature written by a hand smoother than his own. He wanted facts preserved before Amos could change the story. The deputy remained near the gate, uncertain whether to leave. Silas called him back and requested that each objection be entered into the official record. He also demanded written confirmation that Clara had not been arrested, charged, or ordered from the ranch. Amos objected. He claimed Silas was allowing a stranger to control him. Silas turned toward the sound of his dragging boot. Clara was not a stranger, he said. She was the only person who had shown him the complete records. Then he stepped aside. He did not speak for her again. Clara presented the forged invoice, the altered cattle pages, the cut rope from the east gate, and the sample of powder found beneath the horse's feed. She explained the evidence calmly, never claiming more than she could prove. The deputy studied the documents and granted her until the auction to present the originals in Dry Creek. Once the riders departed, Silas placed every key to the ledger room in Clara's hand. Amos would no longer enter without her permission or a second witness. For the first time, the workers saw who truly held Silas's trust. Martha waited until the yard was quiet before revealing something she had hidden for 2 years. On the night of the barn fire, she had seen Amos carrying a replacement oil lamp toward the west stall. The following morning, he warned that she would lose her home if she questioned him. Silas did not blame her silence. He knew fear could make even honest people doubt their own memories. Jonah Price returned to examine what remained of the lamp. Beneath the blackened metal, he found a small hole drilled near the base. Oil would have leaked slowly across the floor before the flame reached it. The fire had not been an accident. Clara searched the old desk again. Her fingers found a thin wooden panel beneath the lowest drawer. Behind it lay a narrow packet of accounts written by Silas's father. The records showed no loan from Dry Creek Bank. Instead, the bank owed Reed Ranch money from several cattle sales that had never been transferred. Payment dates matched the nights when Amos secretly moved animals through the east gate. One final page had been torn from the packet. Only a jagged strip remained, marked with the edge of the broken triangle seal. Clara understood what was missing. The final page must contain the name of the person who approved the false accounts. Amos had likely taken it. Silas ordered 2 horses prepared for Dry Creek. He intended to face the auction openly, not hide behind the ranch gates. Before they left, he addressed the gathered workers. Clara would speak for the records because she had uncovered them. No man was to interrupt her, correct her, or claim her work as his own. He called her his partner. The words settled over the yard more powerfully than any promise of marriage. That evening, Jonah entered the house carrying the ruined oil lamp. Inside the drilled opening, pressed deep beneath the metal rim, he had found a thread of dark wool. It matched the coat Amos had worn for years. Clara spread the surviving records across the dining table while rain pressed against the windows. The broken triangle seal appeared on cattle receipts, medicine orders, freight bills, and the false mortgage. What had looked like separate acts of theft now formed a single line stretching back more than 2 years. Silas's father had first noticed the missing cattle shortly before his death. His private accounts showed animals leaving Reed Ranch under one brand and appearing days later in Dry Creek under another. The payments passed through a transport company connected to Edwin Pike, but the money never returned to the ranch. After Silas inherited the land, he began asking Amos for the original sales records. The barn fire came 3 weeks later. Clara arranged each date in order: the private purchase of lamp oil, the medicine acquired without explanation, the wagon hired through Pike Transportation, the forged payment entered after Silas lost his sight. The fire had not been meant to kill him. A dead rancher would have brought lawyers, court officials, and a complete examination of the estate. Amos needed Silas alive, isolated, and dependent on the man who claimed to have rescued him. Once Silas could no longer read the ledgers, Amos controlled every number placed before him. Healthy cattle became dead cattle. Secret sales became winter losses. Money owed to Reed Ranch became a debt supposedly owed to the bank. Clara realized the arranged marriage belonged to the same plan. Pike had known about her dispute with her uncle. He knew she could read contracts and livestock records, but he also knew the town considered her difficult and unwanted. By sending her to Silas without either person's consent, he created a scandal ready to be used against them. If she remained, Pike could claim a desperate woman had manipulated a blind landowner. If Silas sent her away, she would disappear before noticing the altered books. They had expected humiliation to silence her. Instead, it had placed the one person capable of reading their fraud inside the house. The discovery left Clara colder than the rain. Even her uncle's cruelty had been purchased. A payment in Amos's ledger matched the week she was forced onto the westbound wagon. Her family had not merely abandoned her, they had been paid to deliver her. Silas heard the change in her breathing. He did not offer an easy assurance that the betrayal no longer mattered. He remained beside her until she could place both hands flat against the table and continue. Clara told him Amos and Pike had arranged their meeting, but they had not created what followed. They had not chosen Silas's kindness. They had not chosen her decision to remain. They had not chosen the trust now standing between them. For the first time that night, Silas lifted his head. The plan could explain why she arrived. It could not claim why she stayed. They needed the missing page before the auction. Martha remembered Amos keeping a small iron box beneath the floorboards of his room. While Jonah watched the yard, Clara and Silas entered the empty bunkhouse. Silas counted the boards from the wall while Clara searched for disturbed nails. The 9th plank lifted. Beneath it lay the iron box. Inside were the old bank seal, shipping tags bearing the broken triangle, and several pages covered with attempts to copy Silas's signature. Some were clumsy, others were nearly perfect. The torn final page from his father's accounts rested beneath them. It named Edwin Pike as the holder of the false freight company and recorded payments made directly to Amos for unlisted cattle. A second list contained smaller payments to a bank clerk, a freight driver, Clara's uncle, and 2 men who had signed as witnesses on contracts they had never seen. One name had been marked twice: Thomas Vale, assistant clerk at Dry Creek Bank. Beside his name, Amos had written that the man had begun asking questions. Clara remembered seeing Vale near the bank during her journey west. He had watched Pike's wagon with the expression of someone afraid to be recognized. If he was still alive, He could testify that the mortgage had been created inside the bank. A door slammed in the yard. Amos had returned early. Clara wrapped the original pages inside her coat while Silas replaced the plank. They left through the rear entrance moments before Amos entered the bunkhouse. By dusk, Jonah had located Thomas Vale at an abandoned stage station north of town. The clerk had fled after Pike ordered him to destroy the original account books. He still possessed a bank register showing that Reed Ranch had never received a mortgage payment. Vale agreed to appear at the auction if the sheriff guaranteed his protection. The evidence was finally strong enough. Then Clara smelled smoke. Flames climbed the western wall of the old barn, moving too quickly to have begun by accident. The remaining ranch records were locked in a cabinet inside, along with the original cattle ledger. Amos had discovered the iron box was empty. He was not trying to frighten them anymore. He was burning the last proof before morning. The fire reached the roof before the ranch hands formed a bucket line. Clara ran toward the barn with the original cattle ledger beneath her coat, but Silas caught her arm before she crossed the doorway. Smoke had already filled the entrance. The remaining records were locked inside a cabinet near the western stall. Jonah threw a soaked blanket over Silas's shoulders. Guided by Clara's voice and his memory of the barn, Silas entered with 2 workers behind him. He could not see the flames, but he knew every post, stall, and uneven board beneath his boots. Clara called the distance to the cabinet from outside. Silas found it moments before part of the roof collapsed. The men dragged the cabinet into the rain. Several pages had burned along the edges, but the original brands, dates, and sales remained readable. By dawn, Amos had disappeared. There was no time to follow him. The auction bell in Dry Creek would ring at 9. Silas and Clara rode into town beside Jonah, Martha, Thomas Vale, and the deputy. Smoke still clung to their clothes. Clara carried the rescued ledger in both hands. The auction had already begun when they reached the courthouse square. Edwin Pike stood beside the auctioneer and announced that Reed Ranch owed more than it was worth. Only one company had registered to buy the property. Its papers carried the broken triangle mark. Pike intended to purchase the ranch through a company he secretly controlled. The first bid was called. Silas demanded that the sale be suspended. Pike mocked the blind rancher for arriving too late, but Silas did not appeal for sympathy. He asked the sheriff to examine evidence of fraud before disputed land was sold. Clara stepped onto the platform with the ledger. Murmurs followed her. The town knew her as the unwanted bride Amos had called dishonest. She kept her eyes level and began with the cattle. 3 animals listed as dead had been found alive. Dozens more had been declared lost, then shipped under the broken triangle mark. The feed accounts proved those cattle remained on Reed land after Amos claimed they were gone. Clara placed the altered pages beside the originals. The replacement paper was newer. Serial numbers had been scraped away. Sale payments never reached Silas. Jonah testified that the black gelding had been drugged. He also displayed the damaged oil lamp and the dark wool found inside its drilled opening. Martha testified that she had seen Amos carry the replacement lamp into the barn before the fire. Then Thomas Vale opened the bank register. Reed Ranch had never received a mortgage loan. The false account had been created after Silas lost his sight and funded with money from stolen cattle. Vale produced an order bearing Pike's signature, instructing him to use a seal from a bank branch that had already closed. Pike accused every witness of lying. He claimed Clara invented the fraud because she wanted Silas's property. He reminded the crowd that her own family had rejected her and that she had arrived under a false marriage arrangement. Clara waited until he finished. Then she opened Amos's iron box. Inside were the old bank seal, copied signatures, shipping tags, and the missing page from Silas's father's records. She read the final entry aloud. It listed payments from Pike to Amos for stolen cattle, forged debts, and the money given to Clara's uncle to send her west. The plan described Clara not as a bride, but as a way to make Silas appear incapable of managing his land. The square fell silent. Clara asked why a debtor's signature had been practiced repeatedly in Amos's room. She asked why a dead man had witnessed the mortgage, and why Pike's private company was the only buyer prepared to take Reed Ranch. Pike could not answer. The sheriff stopped the auction. Amos appeared behind the freight office and tried to reach his horse with a satchel of banknotes and forged contracts. Deputies arrested him before he reached the saddle. The charges were read publicly: cattle theft, fraud, forgery, conspiracy, arson, and deliberate injury connected to the barn fire. Pike was taken into custody beside him. The foreclosure was declared invalid. Dry Creek Bank was ordered to return the withheld cattle money, and every false debt was removed from the county record. No gunfight saved Reed Ranch. It was saved by dates, brands, witnesses, signatures, and a woman who refused to believe truth belonged only to powerful men. Silas addressed the town after the sheriff finished. He said Clara had not saved the ranch because she was his bride. She had saved it because she understood the records, protected the evidence, and remained when leaving would have been easier. The people who had whispered about her stood silent. For the first time since her father's death, no one could take Clara's work, hide her name, or call her useless without being answered by the truth. Share this story with someone who has ever been judged before being understood. Save it, and subscribe for more stories where courage and patience bring hidden injustice into the light. That evening, Reed Ranch belonged to Silas again. But when Clara returned to her room, she folded the old gray dress into her valise and began to pack. Clara finished packing before sunrise. Reed Ranch was safe. Silas had his land, his accounts, and the loyalty of his workers. Clara had earned enough wages to travel wherever she chose. For the first time in years, no one could decide her future for her. She carried her valise downstairs and found Silas waiting on the porch. Snow had fallen overnight, covering the yard and the burned barn timbers in white. He heard the case touch the floorboards. Silas did not ask her to stay because she owed him. He did not mention the food, the room, or the protection he had offered. Instead, he placed 2 documents on the porch rail. The first was a letter recommending Clara as an accountant and livestock manager. The second offered her a legal share of Reed Ranch. Silas explained that it was not payment for saving him. It recognized the work she had already done and the future he hoped they might build together. Clara asked whether the ranch needed her badly enough to make him generous. Silas said the ranch could hire another bookkeeper. The house could not replace the woman who had taught him what trust sounded like. He did not need a nurse or a bride chosen by strangers. He wanted a partner who would question what was wrong, speak when others expected silence, and stand beside him without surrendering herself. Clara looked across the snow-covered pasture. Silas had given her a room without a locked door, honest work, and kindness without ownership. Most of all, he had given her the freedom to leave. She lowered the valise. Clara said she would not stay because she had nowhere else to go. She would stay because Reed Ranch was the first place where her choices belonged to her. Weeks later, they married before Martha, Jonah, and the sheriff. Clara signed beside Silas as his wife and equal owner of the ranch. On the first clear morning of winter, they stood at the gate where the wagon had abandoned her. Clara described the silver fences, the barn being rebuilt, and the black gelding running across the northern field. Silas said the house had changed the day she entered it. Clara took his hand. "It became home the day you opened the door without asking me to leave my dignity outside."